Alright, so these notes are part of our unit on the nervous system, Unit 2, and they're specifically going to be focusing on nerve impulses and reflexes. So a nerve impulse is really at the heart of it what we've been calling these messages that are sent to and from your nervous system. It's a series of chain reactions of chemical events that allow your neurons to send messages. So when in previous notes we talked about afferent or sensory messages being sent toward the central nervous system, or motor or efferent messages being sent away from the central nervous system, there's no real messages. They're actually chemical events, almost like a domino effect, that occur in your neurons that allow your body to trigger a response. We call that, in generalized terms, a message. Now, if we look at a diagram to kind of remind ourselves of what we talked about leading up to this, when I look at this here, I have some sort of stimulus that's going to trigger a response that is sent to my central nervous system through those unipolar neurons, through that sensory afferent division. It gets to my central nervous system, a decision is made, and the decision is sent out through those multipolar neurons, through my motor efferent pathway, eventually to stimulate some organ or muscle to do something in response to the initial stimulus. So what we're talking about in these notes is what exactly must happen to stimulate the central nervous system. How do I get from here to here? What happens along the axon of those neurons to get the message of this stimulus to the central nervous system and to get the message from here to the effector organ? Oh my God, do you hear my puppy in the background? Get out. Alright, so there are 6 basic steps in a nerve impulse. The first thing that must happen is that a neurotransmitter must bind to the neuron. Once that occurs, you're going to have 2 events that happen repeatedly over and over again down the length of the axon of the neuron. And these 2 events are depolarization and repolarization. Again, you're going to have depolarization, repolarization, depolarization, repolarization over and over down the length of the axon till it reaches the terminal of the neuron. Once it reaches the terminal, it's going to release another neurotransmitter, and then the neuron has to regain resting potential to put everything back where it came from. So then, to kind of just summarize the main part of these steps, and again, of course, we're going to go into detail in these. The first thing that might happen, here's my neuron, orient yourself first. I have my cell body, dendrites, axon covered in a myelin sheath, and axon terminals. So a neurotransmitter binds to my dendrites here on my neuron. That stimulates 2 events to happen repeatedly down the length here of my axon, depolarization and repolarization. Once it reaches the terminals here, another neurotransmitter is going to be released, and that stimulates the next move. And that next move could be another nerve impulse if it's connected to another neuron, or it could be the stimulation of a muscle or organ. So you noticed in one of those steps, the last thing that has to happen is resting potential. But even though it's the last thing we have to regain, we actually start with resting potential. Resting potential refers to the natural state of a neuron when it's not doing anything, when it's not completing a nerve impulse, when it's not doing anything special, not sending any messages, when it's just chilling, relaxing. That's its natural resting potential. And what this really refers to is how these charged particles that are going to be used in sending the message are naturally displaced around the axon. So before a nerve impulse or a message is even sent, you have sodium ions on the outside of the axon and potassium ions on the inside. And the way they are balanced is so that you actually have a little bit more sodium ions on the outside than potassium on the inside, so the outside is actually slightly more positively charged than the inside. That means in its natural state, a neuron's axon is polar. And you hopefully remember from either chemistry or biology that polar means we have this imbalance of charge. One end of a structure or molecule has a different polar charge than the other side. So in this case, the outside of an axon on a neuron has a much more strong positive charge or pull than the inside of the axon. And so it's polar. And just like most things in nature, we don't want it to be polar, right? Particles don't want to be uneven. They want to be spread out in an equilibrium. Energy doesn't want to be all grouped together in one source. It wants to spread from areas of high to low energy. And similarly here, we don't want more of one particle on the outside of the axon than the inside. We want a balance of charge across the axon. So that naturally polarized axon is actually what's going to drive this nerve impulse or these messages down the length of the axon. We can see here in a diagram, if I look at this, it looks a little weird at first. So the red lines are referring to the structure of the axon of a neuron. This would be like the inside of the cable cord or the axon. This would be the outside. So naturally, the outside again has more sodium positively charged ions than we do have potassium positively charged ions on the inside. So simply because there's more positive sodiums on the outside, that makes it slightly more positively charged, creating that polarized axon. So to rewind again, the first thing that had to happen to trigger a nerve impulse was the neurotransmitter had to bind to the neuron. Once that happens, the next step that's going to be initiated is depolarization. Depolarize literally translates to mean to remove the uneven charge. So that imbalance of charge we have from the sodium and potassium ions is going to be removed by opening the sodium pumps and sodium moving into the axon. If I look here, again, we started with my axon here, more sodium on the inside, less potassium on the inside, -5, Miss Rosa, more sodium on the outside, and less potassium on the inside. In depolarization, a sodium pump is going to open and sodium is going to fly in, temporarily creating a balance of charge in the axon. Directly following that, we have a next event of repolarization. And repolarize is the exact opposite of depolarize. It literally translates to bring back the uneven charge. This happens by the potassium pumps opening and potassium ions moving out of the axon. So if we look at a diagram here, again, we just depolarized, which meant sodium moved into the axon, temporarily balancing the charge. Right after we repolarized by allowing the potassium pumps to open and the potassium to move out of the axon. So in these two events, we have sodium moving in, potassium moving out. And remember I said from that first slide that those events are going to happen over and over again down the length of the axon. I'm going to have over and over repeated sodium in, potassium out, sodium in, potassium out, sodium in, potassium out, sodium in, potassium out, until we reach the axon terminals. Once we reach the terminals, we have completed all the cycles of depolarization and repolarization, and a neurotransmitter is released. This neurotransmitter is a special chemical that's going to bind to either the next neuron that's close to it or organ, depending on how things are set up. That chemical neurotransmitter then will stimulate another nerve impulse, or it'll stimulate a muscle contraction. And again, that's just specific to either if it shares a junction with a neuron or if it shares a junction with an organ. If I look here at my picture again, I've got a kind of zoomed out image here of a multipolar neuron. Again, the neurotransmitter would have bound here to start events. I would have had depolarization and repolarization happening over and over again down the length of the axon. When it reaches the terminals here, which they have zoomed in, these special chemicals called neurotransmitters are released at the terminals, and it either is going to bind to an organ that's close to it or a neuron to stimulate a response to the initial stimulus. Now, once we have done all that, that sounds great, and we have made something happen. We've made your arm move, we've made your stomach secrete gastric juice, whatever it may be. Except now the problem is we have those ions all in the wrong place, and everything has to get put back together so that neuron can send the next nerve impulse. So now, to regain resting potential, that natural state that your neuron exists in, we have to actively transport or force those sodium and potassium ions back in and out to where they belong. Maybe you remember from biology that active transport refers to when we force particles against a natural gradient, so from low to high concentration. And in order to force things in an opposite direction they naturally flow in within living systems, it does require the use of energy or ATP. So in this case, at the end of that nerve impulse, once that neurotransmitter has been secreted, your neurons have to use ATP in order to force sodium ions back out where they're supposed to be and potassium ions back to the inside. So once again, we ended here just like this. At the very end of a nerve impulse, I now have most of my sodium on the inside of the axon and my potassium on the outside, which is the exact opposite of how my axon should be structured to trigger and be prepared for the next nerve impulse. So your neuron is going to use energy from the molecule ATP to force these channels back open and force the potassium back inside and the sodium back out so that it looks like how we started with that resting potential. Now, we just went over the parts of a nerve impulse, and the main bulk of the activity is happening in the axon of the neuron. And you may remember from the last set of notes that oftentimes an axon is covered in a weird jelly-like tissue called the myelin sheath. And we've mentioned that the myelin sheath is made of those oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells. We've mentioned that it helps increase the rate at which those messages or nerve impulses are sent, but we didn't really explain why or how that occurs. So again, the myelin sheath is wrapping around chunks of the axon. But remember, the axon has those sodium and potassium pumps. So when the myelin sheath wraps around the axon, it's also covering huge stretches of sodium and potassium pumps. That means that now the sodium and potassium ions don't have to go in and out every little step or micrometer down the length of the neuron's axon. That means now they can move in or out and then fly down the length of the axon. This allows the ions to travel at much faster rates since they don't have to stop and go in and out every little smidge of the axon. I compare this to driving on main roads versus driving on the freeway. Driving on main roads is like sending a nerve impulse through a neuron that has no myelin sheath. And my cat just attacked my dog. Okay, sorry. So again, driving on main roads is like using a non-myelinated neuron to send an impulse. When you're on a main road and you're driving, you have to stop every block or mile at a stop sign or a stoplight. Then you have to go for another mile or block only to stop again, wait, go another block or mile, stop, wait, go another block or mile, stop, wait. The reason we try not to take side roads when we don't have to is because that simply takes longer. That constant stop and go slows down the rate at which you will get to your eventual destination. So we choose when we can to take freeways. Freeways are like neurons in our body that have a myelinated axon, or an axon covered in a myelin sheath. You take the freeway because you are allowed to fly on the on-ramp onto the freeway with your car, and then you can essentially go super fast down one stretch of the freeway until you have to get off on your off-ramp. That's exactly how the sodium-potassium ions move when there's a myelin sheath. They move in or out in their one pump, and they fly down the length that's covered until they reach the next opening. Again, this allows them to just travel at a much faster rate. It gets the job done much faster, and that is how the myelin sheath actually helps increase the rate or speed of the nerve impulse. Again, if we look here, we're saying again that this myelin sheath is covering chunks of the axon. That means that if a sodium jumps in right here, it flies down this whole stretch here. Potassium flies out, flies down this whole stretch here. Sodium in, flies down this stretch here. rather than going in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, stop and go down the whole length of this axon, which just is more time consuming. Now, to review the main parts of the nerve impulse, because I know that was a lot of detail we covered, the first thing that happened was that a neurotransmitter bound to the dendrites here in the neuron. That's going to trigger the nerve impulse. You are then going to have depolarization and repolarization, depolarization, repolarization, depolarization, repolarization down the length of the axon. And remember, depolarization is just the movement of sodium ions into the axon, and potassium moving out is the repolarization. So I could also say it as sodium in, potassium out, sodium in, potassium out, sodium in, potassium out, sodium in, potassium out. Once those events reach the terminals here, a neurotransmitter will be released from the terminal, and that will bind to the next neuron or organ and either stimulate the next nerve impulse or organ movement. Now, these messages, as we talked about in our last notes, can be a result of voluntary conscious decision and movement, or they can be the result of involuntary motion. You have certain involuntary responses in your body called reflexes that are pre-programmed to react even faster than any other type of response in your body to very specific stimuli. The whole reason we have reflexes is because there are certain triggers that our body responds to as an immediate life or death situation. And so the reflex, or the response that happens super fast, is intended to help save either a part of your body, your life, etc. Now, because they have to happen so much faster than the typical nerve impulse and typical response, reflexes do not travel the entire length toward the central nervous system and all the way back to the effector organs. Traveling all that just decreases speed, so to increase efficiency, your reflexes reroute at the spinal cord. So you have some sort of stimulus that triggers a nerve impulse. This impulse is sent toward the central nervous system to the spinal cord, and it's actually rerouted right at the spinal cord back out to the effector organ to make you flinch, reflex, or respond as necessary. So let's look at a diagram of this. The typical one we're familiar with is probably at the doctor's office when you have before been smacked in the knee. You probably hated your doctor for a second for that. Maybe that's just me. So when your doctor smacks you in the knee here, he's actually hitting a bundle of nerves. The pre-programmed reflex here for these nerves is a kicking motion. So this message still triggers a nerve impulse toward the central nervous system in your spinal cord, but as a pre-programmed response, it is rerouted back out, and it automatically triggers the muscles in your leg to flex and contract to get you to kick. Otherwise, if it didn't do that, it would be a couple seconds delay because it'd have to go to the spinal cord, up to your brain, back down your spinal cord, back out to your leg. So it just makes things more efficient to avoid all that and reroute at the spinal cord. Now you have two types of reflexes, somatic and autonomic reflexes. Somatic reflexes stimulate skeletal muscles. So these are the muscles on top of your bones, muscles that make up your arms, your legs, your face, your back, parts of your torso, your abdomen. Those are your skeletal muscles. So things like when you jerk your arm away from a hot stove, you jerk your hand away if you touch something really sharp, anything like that is going to be a somatic reflex. And it's still the same pathway that we just looked at. It's just a specific type of muscle that's stimulated in this case. An autonomic reflex typically refers to the stimulation of smooth muscle, but it also includes your heart, which is cardiac muscle. So in the case of an autonomic reflex, we're talking about basically internal organs, your lungs, your heart, your stomach, your intestines, your kidneys. Those all have their own pre-programmed reflexes, but they are triggered by the autonomic section of your reflex pre-programming.